Hey guys, I'm Dean. Thanks for joining me. I thought I would start today by helping people to really understand how to program their Apex. As you can see here by looking at my Fusion dashboard, it looks scary. And a few months ago, I was kind of where you guys were when you start off. I've got some friends who've got an Apex recently. Their dashboard looks a little bit more like this. They've just got their first bars, they're using to physically switch them on or off. It's not even running on a timer, they're not even sure how to set the alarms, and they're just using these graphs to have a look at them. So how do we get from here to here? And what on earth is going on? Well, you can see here on the left hand side, I've still got the various probes that are going on. Now beyond that, I have everything set up in terms of the monitoring. So I have, for example, the alarms, the email, the sound, the warnings, but I also want to be able to know whether the power has gone off or on to the Apex. Yes, there's ways of being able to set VOs up for that. I also have every sensor set up as an individual VO. That means my salinity, my temperature, and the reason why I can do that is I can physically isolate one. So rather than simply calling it in my email alarm, I might have so many things going on in any one of these email alarms. You can see here, there's loads of things I want to be told about, that when I actually go back to those things, it may be that my salinity is going out, I want to isolate that one. It means I still receive alarms from something else, but I don't have to keep told every half an hour, hey, there's a problem with your salt when I'm out of home. So that's the reason why you would have things set up as a VO. It gives you isolation. Another reason why you might use a VO is, in the center here, I have my physical outlets. Now my physical outlets are all set to auto, because auto could be working from a time. It may be at a certain time, turn the pump or the lights to this color or this speed. It may be that I want the skimmer to come on, except if something else has happened, then turn it off. And so the auto means that these are all dependent upon each other. And they're not dependent upon each other. So for example, if the temperature is this, turn the heater on or off. It'll also be if one of the other VOs is doing something, then turn, the relevant physical outlet on or off. Which is why we set things to auto and not physical on or off. The exception is here. I have some some virtual outlets set up here, which I work as manual switches. Yes, I can use the feed cycles. I can push one of those. There's a timer attached to it, and then it'll work for a period of time. It'll do something, and then it'll turn it off. So it could turn the pumps down a little bit. It could turn the lights on. I can use it as a maintenance schedule. I wanted to get deeper into those, and I certainly wanted more than 4. So for example, I could simply turn on a light switch or turn it off. And that will do something on the tank. Maybe I want to get my tank ready for taking a photograph, in which I need to turn the lights to a certain color and turn the pumps down. Or it may be that after dark I want to be able to turn the lights on and put a red light on there and just see what's going on with the critters inside the tank. I use these as physical switches. Sorry, they act as lock switches, but they are only virtual outlets which I've set up that way. On the right hand side, I've got various sensors, so my breakout boxes. Again, every breakout box is set up as a virtual switch. The reason being, I want to be able to control them independently. If it's closed, then off. If it's open, then on. I've found that when you actually call the switches direct in any one of the other programming, sometimes it switches on, but it doesn't switch off again. So by setting them up as virtual switches in the breakout box, every switch has a state which is pre-programmed in. Plus you can put in a little defer in there for 10 seconds or something to say, look, make sure it's at this state for a few seconds, just in case it bobs up or down. And then I have advanced switches down here, which could be anything between winter time and summertime. It may be I have different time things or different things happening at different times of the year. Physically switching something to on or off from winter to summer just allows me to sort of control fans or something at a different time, and I use these. The most interesting one is this maximum time here. Why do I use that? So maximum time is if I, for example, turn the light switch on and I walk away from the computer, I walk away from the tank, the phone rings, somebody rings at the doorbell or something, I want to make sure that after a set period of time, this is now overwritten. Even though this is a physical light switch, okay, the way this is now programmed is that will stay on, it'll override all the other lighting programs in the auto mode, but there is a safety mechanism by this maximum time here that after 20 minutes it will turn itself back off again. Even though the switch will still stay on, it will be rendered useless after 20 minutes. So these are all the sorts of things you can do with VOs, and all the way that you can kind of get the programming set up to give advanced features to all of these different, sort of skimmers and pumps and all the rest of these things. So I've got 3 breakout bars with 6, there's 18 physical things attached, as well as various other sensors here. So how on earth do you start to get programmed with all of this? Well, you're going to need to get beyond the Apex Fusion, and you're going to have to get into the classic dashboard. The reason being is to set up virtual outlets, you can't do it within this area here. So to set up the classic dashboard, the best way is to go to the Neptune side, get to the support, get to the firmware, and download one of the firmwares. The reason you'll do that is you'll suddenly get your software, you'll be able to open it up, and when you open it up it'll say search here, search for controllers, and it'll tell me what network address internally my Apex is sitting on. Now every piece of technology in your house, okay, will have an individual address. This is an internal address, okay, and so this will open up. If I go into a web browser and simply type in 10.0.1.5, it gives me the web interface to this piece of technology in my house. If I typed in another number, it may be that I could get access to my router, or to my cable TV, or to my switch. Everything will have a web interface which lets you go into some advanced programming mode. Now, this dashboard here looks a little bit Fusion-like. The difference is this is the direct link into the Apex. If I do anything here, it automatically turns off. There's no lag that Fusion may have. Fusion's pretty damn good for me. I've used it for over a year. But this does give you an immediate response to it. So that's just the dashboard. It's very Fusion-like. But you can see here there are a couple of other buttons here. Season table and configuration. Season table is literally, I think it's set from somewhere like in Indonesia, in Bali. It shows you what the typical sunrise, moonrise and sets, what temperatures are at certain points during the year, January, right the way through to October, to December, and you can choose any month of the year. You can actually go and override these settings if you really wanted to. I use these for moon, if I want to create a lunar schedule. Some people use them for season, temperature schedules. It's all pre-programmed into the Apex, so it gives you access for some advanced coding. If you want the sun to, your lights to come on and go off at a seasonal time as opposed to a physical time. But these are the ones you're going to mostly look at here, your configuration. Now I'm going to start here in network. Why? This here is where my Apex is sitting back end. Now currently I've got DHCP disabled. Why? I want 10.0.1.5 always to be remembered. This Apex, I want always to be this address. It lets me bookmark this number, and it means every time I type this number in or press the bookmark, my Apex bookmark, it'll find me the classic dashboard. If it's disabled, well, dynamic addressing is enabled, it means every time I come back to try and find the Apex, it may have moved because my router will give it another address. I've got to come back to here and find it again. For firmware updates, this must be disabled. You must have it on dynamic addressing while you're doing the firmware updates, but anything beyond that, I simply switch it off and have it controlled here. You press reboot, you simply go and update the settings, and you're good to go. Okay? The other things on here, if you sort of look at them, is display setup. Display is, yes, that little thing that's stuck on the front of your tank, and you want to be able to control it in terms of what it looks like, page 1 to 4. Do you want big numbers, small numbers? What is it that you want to show? What are the icons you want? Do you want even one icons, in what order, which graphics? This is it all here. That's your configuration display setup. Outlet setup, again, a little bit Fusion-like. These are all of those there. Okay, it's the same if I go to my Fusion and go to my outlet setup over here. You can see what they also it's my profiles. Outlet setup here. You can see exactly what they are, and you can see again these are all numbered. Okay. And so if you look at all these numbers here, they all mean something. We'll go into that in a second. But you can see here that's where they're all set up. You can see the icon. This icon is what gets displayed on your screen, okay, on the dashboard if you're using them. The ability to keep the logs and track logs if you want to. Control type, advanced versus the pre-programmed stuff. Okay, we'll go to that later on. Profiles, well, we just had a quick look on profiles on Fusion there. These are all your stuff that you want to be able to control. Light colors, weather patterns, pump speeds. We reference those when we're going to go through to actually create the various, what if I push a button, what do I want it to do? I want the pump to go to a certain speed, or I want the lights to go to a certain color. That's all set up under profiles. Probes you probably already come across anyway. Probes is literally where you turn your temperature. If you want it into Celsius or Fahrenheit, you want to be able to turn the salinity, all the different switches that are all happening here. This is also where all your switches are, or your breakout switches. If I want to rename a switch, okay, sometimes you find when you initially start it, by calling them the physical number, it doesn't always work. So you actually rename them here. So I rename the switch, for example, SWS7. I just call it something more useful, like dose switch. Then I know it's the switch from my doser. So it's easy for me to program if I rename stuff. Module setup. Module setup. Two very important things. The physical things attached to my Apex, whether it's my WXM, whether it's the physical, the power bars, they're all linked into here. This is where you can select which one, you can update their firmware, and again rename them to something more useful if it helps you when you're programming stuff in. And you submit the change. You choose the one you want, okay, you push your button, for example, update firmware, and submit. So this is all of these. You can see all my software, the firmware, not for the Apex, the firmware for the individual devices is here. If it ever comes up with old, it means, for example, your WXM may not work because the firmware may be out of date. So this is this section here where you control the firmware of the items attached to it, and now what I've called the name, which means I can now call those when I start doing my programming. But you've also got this section here, Add Module, and it gives me the idea, just the first two really is what you're interested in, 8 or 4. And it gives me an address. It also gives me the ability to delete outlets. So this is where you set up a virtual outlet. Now, say I want to create I need 5 variable outlets. I know that I'm not using, for example, a certain numbering system. So if you look through mine, I know, for example, the switches are set up under, maybe C's or B's, or I'm using B's here for sometimes weather patterns, and maybe I'm using C's for something else, I'm using A's for something else. They're not all in order on Fusion, it's not very good. But in here, they are all in order, and I can see exactly what they are, and so if you come back to the configuration outlet setup here, I can see what those numbers are. And I can see exactly where they're going on. Well, actually, none of them are in order, are they? There you go, it's just a bit confusing. But I know from my programming that I've got the various switches set up under B's or C's. Now, the reason why that may make it easier is because when you start getting to the programming and you want to add things up later on, you can add more numbers. So I'm going to add in 8, okay, here. And I'm going to start off in H. Now that's going to add in 8 little VOs starting at H1 to H8. Now I appreciate this might seem a little bit confusing at the beginning, but I would say, while that's doing that, get a piece of paper or Word or something like that and start typing in all the code. Write it all down. It means I can have I can sit there and work out what's going on in my programming. You can see here, I've got them in numbers. I know what's going on. I know what the numbers are. I can see what's actually happening here. If I start going down into the various settings, you say A1, A2, A3, I know what I'm calling them. I know what they're related to. I can do find and replaces in here. And I can sit there and actually see everything that's happening at this level here. If you want to, first of all, create a little programming sheet here, you know what I would do? I would go to reeftronics.net, and what you can do here is you can link your Apex. If I go here, ding dong, that's where you'll find mine. You simply go into here now. This is now where all the guys using the Apex have got their code. You can go and see my status, you can see my programming code here, you can get the programming, and this is a direct access into my Apex, and you can see all the programming in one go, in order. And so here's where you would simply be able to go in. This is all publicly available on the net. You can see what's going on, you can see how I programmed or how any of the other guys are programmed. This is how I learned. It'll produce a document here, which you simply copy and paste and put it into your Word document, and then you can start everything from there. And what this does, it gives you all access to what's called the advanced mode. So it's not just the little temperature. So you can see here, if time is this, then pulse. Pulse will have a different thing later on. So these are the programming. You can see here, all the code here. And if I come down to here, there'll be maximum times. You come all the way down here, you know, you suddenly find that pulse will be down here somewhere, one of the profiles. There you go, pulse. Pulse is a pump, tells me when it's on, when it's off, what the maximum intensities are. So if I want to be able to control that later on, that's now how either a physical or a virtual outlet is being programmed to reference a profile. Copy and all, paste and all of that, take it to your Word document, paste it in there, and then you can sit there and offline and look at all the code and try and get your head around what is going on. Okay? Let's go back to our Apex now it's done this. You will see now, if I look down on my outlets, H1 to H8. Okay? Forget what they're called. These are all demo programs. Lights, pumps, whatever. They don't reference lights or programming. That's just to give you an example. I find this actually really confusing. I don't think it helps at all, personally, because I think for most people, you're thinking, well, is that purely for ozone? No, it's just showing you the code of an example of how to set up an ozone system. I don't need this one anyway. I only wanted 5. Select H8, delete. Okay. Again, I don't need 7 and 6. H7, delete. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to show you how, if you want later on, to add more modules and you want them to be in that same number sequence, how you can add it in. So now you can see I've got H1 to H5, okay? So I've now got 5 virtual outlets now set up. If I go to my Fusion, if I refresh the screen, if I come up here, you'll probably suddenly find, there you go, I've now got extra parts which I can simply drag on, extra virtual outlets which I can simply drag on to this screen here and start to program if I want to work in Fusion mode here. Now say I wanted to add in an extra few more later on. Remember I was saying here these number systems, A1, A8 or whatever, and I wanted to add in a few more. I simply come in again. I now know that I run at H5, so what I will start to do is I will add in another 4 and I will start it at H6, add module. Now that will put in some more sequence because you can have A to H, I think you can actually have 255 or something under each one. So there's quite a lot of ability to program these virtual outlets in. Give you, a couple of thousand to play with if you wanted to. So it just means that's why you'd need to have them in sequence. It just now means you can see here as I go down, there you go, I've added in H6, 7, 8 and 9. So you can see I've added in a whole load more. You will see them, it's just again, it's put them with lights and pumps. Forget what they are, same thing again. Now once I've got these set up, I can now go back into my outlet setup, or if I wanted to do it in Fusion, okay, I can simply go in here, new tiles, drag them down and start programming accordingly. That's how you set up virtual outlets. Now let's understand how an outlet is. So I'm going to set up a virtual outlet here for the timing switch here. So if let's look at light switch. What would light switch do? Well, light switch here, it's just set off. However, I've got this link here that says if outlet maximum times another virtual outlet is on, then off. And all this is doing is it's basically saying this light switch should be on or off. Okay, it should be on or off. And it's not ever set to automatically, because this is me physically turning something on or turning something off. But if I turn it on, I don't want it to sort of carry on indefinitely, I want to have a maximum time. So the programming code always starts at top, and then it will say, do this unless this line, unless the line afterwards. And this is quite important when you go down. When you start to program stuff, it has to be in order. Okay, so you do this, unless this, unless this, unless this. We now come back to the maximum time code. You will see here it's set off, but if the photo ready, or in this case the light switch is on, then turn maximum time on. Okay, but, and what I want it to do is to have it on for 20 minutes to have it on. Okay, so it'll have 20 minutes on, but then 5 seconds after that it'll switch off. Now what this will mean is it'll come on, it'll stay on for 20 minutes, but then it'll turn itself off. And so what you've done here is you've programmed it so that it's always off, okay? And this maximum time, which is always set to auto, now means that when I turn this light switch on, this light switch will be on, but only until maximum time, and then it'll turn itself off. And even though it's not set to auto here, it's referencing this to this, which in turn turns this back off again. Okay, so it'll still say on the dashboard, but the lights will physically go off, trust me. And this is how you start to program everything. It may be that I want to turn around and start having within the power head, you know, within, say for instance, one of the power head, which is my power head. You can see here the nice pretty graph. It's setting up to various profiles here at certain times, at what percentage at that particular profile. Okay, so it's starting to come in, the code and profiles. But you can start to see here, if I press this button, it goes back between wizard and advanced mode. Advanced mode is, it's showing me here these TD data. This is just saying time, percentage, you know, what the profiles are doing and things. Don't have to worry too much about it, but there is some logic in it. Unless photo ready's on, then this. Unless that's on, then do that. Unless that's on, then do this. Unless the feeder's on. Unless the feeder's on, and then I want the feeders to come on at a certain time sequence. So it goes from fast to slow, and then it turns itself off again. So you're able to start getting in and using virtual outlets. You start putting if outlet is this, then profile. Or if outlet this is on, then do another outlet. So you're able to control outlets or virtual outlets simply by having this, what's called this advanced code. It's a bit scary. You go back into here and you can plot the visual stuff in here, but that code behind it is just saying is, look, do this kind of weird graph thing unless I push one of these buttons. And when I turn the light show on, then Nutrient will be, you know, super fast mode on the profile, or it remembers at maximum time, we'll go back to a slow mode. And this is all working in sequence, okay? And then it will just default back to this. So this is part of how the programming is all working in terms of setting these things up. And then you just literally work through one at a time. Heaters are going to be quite easy. If temperature's this, then on. If temperature, I've got two probes, so if the temperature of the sump's this, then on. turn it off, okay, and then you can start to do this, unless I also have this outlet temperature fail here. If I go back to temperature fail, all I've done here is I've set up a range of fail safes. So saying basically if the temperature's gone from one extreme or the other, okay, it's gone really, really cold or really, really high. I'm assuming it's not the temperature, you know, of the water. I've got to assume that either the thermometer or, you know, the temperature sensor or something has failed. In which case, that's when I want to receive an alarm about it. So the programming will normally be, you know, if the temperature is this, turn the heater on or turn it off, unless, of course, something's failed. And if it's failed, turn off, because it may be it's stuck too high, in which case I need to be doing, and then I need to have an alarm about it, in which case there'll be probably an alarm system, there'll be an email alarm in here, and then the thing it'll say here is if the outlet, for example, temperature control is on, or a probe fail is on. Okay, and I will have probe fail. If I look at this probe fail, temperature fail is on, or the pH has gone on into certain things. So here what you're seeing is I'm referencing VOs inside VOs inside VOs. So temperature control is the sequence of what the temperature should be. If it goes outside of there, I assume it's going to have failed, and if it's failed, you better email me. So you're able to start referencing VOs inside VOs inside VOs, and that's why the dashboard looks a little bit long and confusing. It's just building in fail-safes just for certain things, and this is really how the programming is starting to work. The last one I want to just say is about this switch things here. As you can see, we go back again, just to remind you. Switches, if the switch is closed, then off. If the switch is open, then on. Wait 10 seconds just to make sure. I don't want it to, in case it's a power outage or it's just blipped or something, just to make sure, and then turn it on. And then we go back into this whole idea. So each one of those, you know, now has an independent switch. It means if my dosing chamber's gone too low and it starts emailing me and I'm away from home and it's emailing me every hour or sending me SMSs, it's like, fine, you've told me it's there, I can't do anything about it. I can simply turn off this VO switch, okay, even though the actual dosage will still be open, it won't keep sending me emails about this particular thing until I get home, and then I can simply turn it back on again. It means all the way through I'm still receiving email if something else has failed, because I don't want to turn the email alarm off in case suddenly the dosage was low, I turned the email off, but then suddenly, my gosh, the heater's gone on, or there's been a power cut or something. I still need to receive emails. So you isolate things. So you can, this is the whole reason why, again, using VOs, is to either give you isolation or to give you advanced programming capabilities, which can control all of your physical outlets over here. And that's all that it's doing. It's not actually that scary. It does mean, I would say, get into the reference manual. It is comprehensive. It'll need more than a couple of cups of coffee. You're going backwards and forwards. It's all in there. It's really, really good. It is a bit of a head fuck to try and understand what it is at times, especially if you're not used to programming. Okay, but it is all there, and it does start to make sense as you start to get around and play. So I would say, don't be scary. Go to your dashboard, get this set up, get your virtual outlet set up, and start having a play. And one of us on the forums or whatever will start helping you through how to go and get some of this advanced stuff working up. And just remember, on any line of code, okay, advanced mode is not so scary. It just means you start working your way down the way down the screen. You know, do this unless this, unless this, unless this, unless this, unless this. And by the way, just hold it off for a second. I just want to make sure it's definitely doing it before it happens. And that's it. That's all there is to setting up your Apex, moving from your basic, sort of starting point here into something which looks a little bit more complicated, like this. And it'll take you a little while to get your head around it. But boy, can you have a lot of fun and find out a lot of things that are going on in your tank and have the tank running pretty much as automated as you want it to be. So I hope that's been helpful for you. I'm Dean Donaldson. Like the video, and I look forward to seeing you on the forums on Facebook at Neptune Apex Support Group. All the best, guys.